Alright, what is up, guys? I made this little project for Halloween here. It is a light box that has Nightmare Before Christmas on the front of it. I thought it turned out really cool, and I'm not really big on pumpkin carving or decorating, so this is kind of my way to enjoy the season. I thought it, like I said, came out really nice. It's definitely not perfect, but I wanted to throw the clips together to show you what I did well, what I didn't do so well, the materials that I used, and just overall how I put this thing together, because I think it's kind of interesting, and if nothing else, you can at least laugh at my mistakes with me. But hope you enjoy it. If you want to see the whole thing lighting up, I do have a video of that at the end, so feel free to skip there or stick around for the whole thing. But either way, really hope you enjoy it, and thanks for watching.
Alright, and I'm going to stop it right here because we came to my first mistake. I forgot to record myself putting the stencil on, but it's nothing groundbreaking. I just used some spray adhesive with the stencil that I found that I really liked, put it on the wood, and then spray painted over that and removed the paper. So that was that, but just wanted to let you know that's how I did that part of it. Next here is a pretty basic technique. In woodworking, if you're using a scroll saw and you're not coming from the edge of a piece, you have to have holes to put the blade down into. So right here what I'm doing is making those holes so that when the time comes, I won't have to go back and forth between the drill whenever I move on to the next section. After all of those holes are drilled comes the most time-consuming part of this project, which is the cutting portion. I've included the first and final cut of all of the smaller sections, and then when we get to those more intricate details, I'll speak about what I'm doing and how I avoid snapping off those tiny little pieces. If you've never worked with a scroll saw before, there's a lot of vibration when using thin wood like I am in this piece, which then has a tendency to snap where the line gets thin. To avoid that, you'll see me using 2 scrap pieces of thicker wood to ensure that the smaller details are held firmly down on the base plate. Another way to avoid this is to stack and cut multiples of a project, or to just use thicker wood to cut. This is cheap plywood that I had, and initially I was making a door ornament, so I wanted to keep the weight down, but as you'll see in the video, that evolves a bit. So up next, we come to the refining process of the project, which is definitely my least favorite step, but nonetheless important. I use a rasp, file, and sandpaper to clean up where the cut lines meet, and also smooth out all of those edges. I went over the whole thing with sandpaper as well because that rough texture will help paint stick, and then at the end I use an air hose to make sure I have a clean surface and that everything is prepped for that paint. And then comes the base coat of paint. I made sure to spray all of the inner and outer edges, and I even added this little extra clip because there's nothing more fun than watching paint dry. Here's where my idea really started to come together. The scene that I cut is extremely recognizable and is usually a silhouette anyway, so when I saw some cheap lights, it clicked that I needed to make a light box, and that's exactly what I'm doing. It just took a few staples and voila! Next is just a bit more spray paint for the new pieces. Being the back, they won't be as important, but I still made sure to get good coverage on all of the sides and faces. The square back was MDF, and it just soaked up the paint like a sponge. It didn't really hurt anything, but I just thought that was kind of interesting. I also brought the main piece back out to put gloss on and help protect the wood, and seemed to lose quite a bit of that gloss to the wind, but I ended up getting it covered. For the light diffusion of this project, I used a shower curtain, which cost me about $2 and can be used again in future projects as well. It's a nice translucent but not transparent material, so lets some light through but doesn't make it quite so harsh. I laid it out and decided that 4 folds gave me the best diffusion while still letting light through, so I traced that out and then set out some straight lines so that I could cut it better. And then peeling it after cutting was extremely satisfying, and even watching it back, that straight line is pretty darn perfect. Up next, I laid out and dusted the whole thing off because it really liked to pick up all of the dirt and grime from the floor. Then I folded it into its final dimensions, but there were a few creases from the package that I wasn't super happy about, so I got out my heat gun and applied a little heat and just smoothed the whole thing out, and that actually ended up working pretty well, got the whole thing pretty smooth. Then I transferred it to the box and made sure that I had a good fit. It took a little bit of finagling, but I eventually got it where I liked it, and I used staples to keep it in place, and then that also helped me to stretch the material so that it was nice and taut and smooth to give me the best projection surface possible. After that, I cut off the excess material so that I would have the wood underneath exposed. This was really important because I laid down some wood glue on all 4 sides to attach the front plate to the box, and I needed a lot of surface area to make sure that that would stick and not fall off later. Here's where a couple more mistakes were made. I was using weights because I thought they would give me enough pressure to bond the 2 pieces, but I ended up being wrong. So then I got out the clamps and even had a debate with myself about using scrap wood to make sure I didn't mar any of the wood at all, but was too lazy to actually do that. So now my final project has a couple small divots in it, which isn't the end of the world, but definitely could have been avoided. Then came the hinges. I had a couple small ones lying around, and so here I'm laying out where to put them. I just went a couple inches up on both sides and marked the holes to then pre-drill. This actually took me forever because I was trying my hardest to hide the hinges, but I just couldn't find a good way to do that, and they're not very noticeable in the final result, so I was kind of worrying and fretting over nothing, and I think they actually work really well with this. I also repeated this onto the box itself, and I pre-drilled the holes just to ensure that they're in the exact right spot and I don't split the wood at all. The screws that I used were really small, but I didn't want that ruining my project in any way. And then it's also important to note that any screws I put in this also have glue on them so that they hold better and they don't work their way out in the future. With everything put together, I needed a way to keep the box closed, so here I am measuring and drilling holes for eyelets that are going to help me do that. I also drilled straight through the front of my project and into my desk, so I will fix that up later with some wood filler. Again, I added glue to keep the eyelets securely in place, and then I cut and bent a paper clip to use as a bar. I checked 2 different stores and couldn't find a small enough eyelet with a lock on it, so this was my way of improvising, and it actually worked out really well for me. With all of the wood glue in the accidental hole in my board, I grabbed some acrylic paint and just went over the whole thing, making sure to touch up any parts that weren't solid black and really finalizing the paint job on here. The paint was a matte finish that I grabbed, so I did end up going back outside and putting another layer of the gloss coat on as well to just make sure everything was uniform and really shiny. The last step here was positioning and securing the lights that I bought for this project. I also grabbed a portable cell phone charging battery to power everything without the need for an external cord. Overall, I think both things cost me around $10 total and work really well for this project. I did have to adjust the lights several times before sticking them down to make sure that the light coming through was as even as possible, and that did take a little bit of work, but after I knew where I wanted them, this was a pretty straightforward process. After everything was stuck down, with the curves involved, the strip was having trouble staying, so I just grabbed a few small staples and went to work hammering them in on all of the turns, and that was just to make sure that as the project gets older and the tape wears out, the staples keep everything exactly where it's supposed to be. I made sure not to pinch the cable under the staple, but also wanted to ensure that everything was snugly over the wire and wouldn't come out as time goes on. With everything together and the battery charged up, this project is finally over. In total, I think painting and cutting this took me around 3 days to make, or about 4 hours total, not including time to let the paint and glue dry. Costs were pretty minimal, and I'd estimate this whole thing was less than $20 to put together, so with no further ado, here is the final product.